Imagine for a second that you're a forensic software engineer.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right. So you're handed the source code for this incredibly advanced, just completely cutting edge virtual reality simulation. And on the surface, it's sleek, it's modern, it looks, exactly like hard science fiction.
Like spaceships, lasers, that kind of aesthetic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
High definition metallic corridors, sterile medical bays, the whole 9 yards. But then you actually start digging into the code itself. You start looking at the raw underlying architecture that makes the whole simulation run, and you realize something impossible.
The code doesn't match the visuals.
Right. The foundational code isn't new at all. It's written in a language that is like 400 years old. You go in expecting to find the blueprints for a hyperdrive engine, and instead, under the hood, you find ancient magic.
Which is such a perfect analogy for what we're looking at today.
Huh.
Because it's the exact same operating system we've been running for centuries. It's just wearing a radically different user interface right now.
Exactly. And welcome to today's deep dive, because that is exactly the paradigm shift we are unpacking today. We are taking a massive step away from the traditional pop culture narrative of UFOs.
Yeah, that standard extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Right, the ETH, that comforting, almost cozy idea that these are just biological beings from some distant star system, flying physical metal ships to Earth to conduct a clinical scientific survey.
Like intergalactic botanists or something.
Yeah, exactly. But instead, we are looking at this truly groundbreaking document titled Excerpts from UFOs, Abductions, and Occult Parallels. And the mission of this deep dive is to show you how the modern alien abduction narrative is virtually identical, structurally and phenomenologically identical to historical occult initiation rites.
And ancient shamanic journeys. And centuries-old folklore. It's all the same framework.
It really is. So whether you're a hardened skeptic listening to this, or a massive sci-fi fan, or just someone deeply curious about the absolute edges of human experience, this conversation is going to fundamentally alter how you view the architecture of human trauma and anomalous encounters in general.
Because we aren't just going to look at what people are experiencing today. We're going to dig into the why. Why does this phenomenon seem to endlessly recycle the exact same mythic scripts across completely different centuries?
Right. Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand why modern aliens aren't actually, modern at all, we have to travel back a few centuries. We have to see what these entities looked like before they decided to put on silver spacesuits.
Right, before the sci-fi aesthetic became our dominant cultural language.
Yeah, so when did people first start documenting these exact behavioral patterns? Where does the source material start us off?
Well, to find that, we actually have to go to the Scottish Highlands, specifically the late 17th century.
Wait, really? The 1600s?
Yeah, 1691 to be exact. There was this Scottish researcher and clergyman named Reverend Robert Kirk, and he compiled this incredibly detailed study of local folklore called The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies.
Okay, wait. A reverend in the 1690s writing about fairies is our primary starting point for alien abductions. That sounds kind of absurd.
It does sound absurd until you actually read what he documented.
Yeah.
Because Kirk wasn't writing like a book of cute bedtime stories for children. He was acting almost like an early anthropologist.
Oh, so he was taking this seriously.
Very seriously. He documented these beings that he called subterraneans. And he understood them not as imaginary characters, but as tangible, non-human intelligences. Beings that existed in a parallel realm right alongside ours.
Okay, but how does that connect to a UFO report? Because when I think of fairies, I think of, Tinkerbell. I don't think of a gray alien holding a medical scanner.
Right, because our modern concept of fairies has been completely sanitized. But the historical reality of fairy lore is incredibly dark. It's very clinical. Kirk documented that these subterraneans engaged in the physical abduction of humans.
You were kidnapping people.
Yes. And he specifically noted that they induced states of total bodily paralysis in their victims before taking them.
Whoa, paralysis. That's exactly what modern abductees report, that inability to move while the entity approaches the bed.
Exactly, and it gets weirder. He also recorded that these beings had a profound, almost obsessive interest in human reproduction and biology.
Which is literally the defining characteristic of the modern abduction narrative. You read any major case today and people are constantly talking about alien entities harvesting genetic material.
Ova, sperm, the hybridization programs.
Yeah.
And Reverend Kirk in 1691 noted that his subterraneans extracted what he called the pith and milk from local humans and resources.
Pith And milk. That is so creepy. So they were essentially harvesting us.
They were harvesting us using secret, invisible mechanisms. Furthermore, he noted they enforced strict secrecy. They would literally punish people who revealed their existence to the public.
That sounds like the Men in Black stuff we see later.
Very much so. And crucially, Kirk even documented the phenomenon of missing time.
Wait, really? Missing time? That is the absolute hallmark of a modern UFO encounter. You know, driving down a road, seeing light, getting home, and realizing 3 hours are just gone.
It's exactly the same cognitive gap. People in 1691 were reporting the exact same vanished hours. He also recorded the use of screen memories.
Screen memories? Like when an abductee thinks they saw an owl, but it was actually an alien?
Yes. In Scottish folklore, Kirk documented this as the co-walker, or a shape-shifting doppelganger. It's a false image the entity projects directly into the witness's mind to mask its true form.
That is mind-blowing. So the software is exactly the same.
Oh, and one more thing from Kirk. He documented the frequent observation of luminous aerial anomalies, fairy lights.
So UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Exactly. Floating, glowing orbs in the sky. It perfectly mirrors what the military is tracking today.
So long before we had every vocabulary for space travel or quantum physics, the phenomenon was already here. It was doing the exact same things, just wearing a different cultural mask.
That's the key. It adapts its outward manifestation to align perfectly with the prevailing cosmology of the era. If we go back even slightly earlier to the 16th century, we see this with Paracelsus.
The Swiss physician, right? The alchemist.
Yes, Paracelsus. He developed this complex cosmology involving elementals. And he described these composite spirit men that were capable of interacting with the physical world, but they dwelled in parallel dimensions.
I was actually looking at his categorization of these beings in the source material. He talks specifically about gnomes, right? And again, we aren't talking about cute garden ornaments here.
Far from it. Paracelsus associated gnomes with the subterranean world, much like Kirk's fairies. But he described them as hoarding hidden esoteric knowledge. And he noted they operated with this incredibly cold, detached logic. They possessed a distinctly non-human psychology.
Which, I mean, that perfectly describes the modern gray alien. Grays are almost always associated with secret underground bases and this cold, emotionless, strictly logical pursuit of data.
Exactly. But it actually goes even darker than that when we look at the reproductive obsession, because the Middle Ages were full of these reports too.
Right, the incubi and succubi. I've always heard those terms used strictly in the context of demonology, like religious horror.
And they were framed as demons because the prevailing worldview of the Middle Ages was strictly theological. If you saw something supernatural, it was either an angel or a demon. There were no other options.
So the phenomenon just slot right into that religious framework.
Exactly. And these encounters were heavily documented by major theological figures, people like St. Augustine and later the Franciscan friar Ludovico Maria Sinistrari. They wrote extensive, highly detailed treatises on these entities.
And what did Sinistrari actually document about how they operated? Because I'm guessing it sounds familiar.
It sounds identical. He meticulously detailed how these non-human entities would paralyze victims in their beds.
Wow.
Yeah. And then they would engage in forced sexual encounters and genetic manipulation. Their stated goal, according to the medieval records, was to produce hybrid offspring.
Paralysis, nocturnal bedroom visitation, forced reproductive procedures, hybrid offspring. I mean, you're literally describing the Betty and Barney Hill story, or basically any famous abduction case from the 1980s. It's just written in Latin by a medieval friar.
It's the exact same sequence of events.
Okay, so if we establish that medieval folklore and demonology perfectly mirror the modern accounts, when did the visual shift actually happen? When did these entities stop looking like demons or fairies and start looking like the classic pop culture alien?
To find that exact visual pivot, we actually have to look at New York in 1918.
1918, so decades before the Roswell incident or the modern UFO craze in the late 40s.
Long before. The infamous British occultist Aleister Crowley was living in New York, and he was conducting a sustained, intensive magical ritual called the Emelantra working.
Okay, and what was the actual role of that ritual? What was he trying to do?
He was intentionally attempting to open a portal to communicate with extra-dimensional intelligences. And during this extended magical working, Crowley claimed that a specific entity manifested to him. He named this being Lamb.
Lam.
Yes. And Crowley actually drew a sketch of Lamb.
I've seen this sketch, and honestly, it gave me absolute chills, because if you look at it without knowing the context, if you didn't know it was drawn in 1918, you would swear it was drawn in 1995 by a huge fan of The X-Files.
It's uncanny, isn't it? It is a perfect match for the classic gray alien.
Completely. It's got the massive, bulbous, hairless head, the huge slanted eyes, that tiny little slit for a mouth. It lacks any traditional human facial features.
And this was drawn decades before any science fiction pulp magazine had popularized that specific image.
Okay, I have to push back a little here, or at least process this out loud, because the implication is staggering. So you're basically saying that a UFO abduction isn't a physical event involving astronauts from another planet. It's a modern reboot of a magical ritual.
That is the exact framework the historical data suggests, yes.
Like, the phenomenon uses the exact same underlying software. They just updated the user interface to look like sci-fi instead of fantasy.
What's fascinating here is that the shift from demon to fairy to alien isn't a change in the entities themselves. The entities aren't upgrading their ships. It's a shift in the human interpretive framework.
Because we understand technology now.
Exactly. We live in an age defined by profound technological anxiety. Nuclear weapons, space exploration, computers. Therefore, the phenomenon uses the language we currently understand technology to interface with us.
That makes total sense. I mean, if an angel appeared to me right now with flaming swords and a chariot, my modern brain would probably reject it. I'd think I was having a hallucination. But if a biological being steps out of a metallic craft holding a medical scanner, my brain accepts it.
Because you understand the concept of advanced technology. You can process that narrative.
Wow. It speaks to us in the dialect of our own era.
It does. And this is heavily supported by how the earliest modern UFO movements actually started. Investigators like Brooks Alexander and John Weldon have long noted that many reported cases of UFO contact, especially the founders of UFO religions, had significant prior involvement in the occult.
Oh, right. Like the founders of the Raelian movement or the Urantia Foundation, or going back even further to Theosophy.
Yes, how were they actually communicating with these supposed space brothers?
They weren't using radio telescopes to scan the cosmos, were they?
No, they used traditional occult methods. Astral projection, trans-channeling, telepathy, automatic writing.
So the communication channel being utilized is, and always has been, psychic and metaphysical, not technological.
The craft is often just a prop. It's stage dressing for a psychic event.
Okay, this brings us to a huge transition. If this phenomenon is using ancient psychic pathways to reach us, how does an actual encounter begin? I want you to think about this for a second. If you're listening right now, you're just a normal person. Maybe you're driving your car down an empty highway at 2 a.m, or you're lying in bed. How do you go from consensus, boring reality to suddenly interacting with an ancient archetype wearing a spacesuit?
Right, because it's not a seamless transition. The architecture of the encounter requires a primary rupture, a severe break from the mundane, linear material world.
A shift into a liminal space.
Exactly. British UFO researcher Jenny Randles coined a brilliant term for this initial stage. She called it the Oz factor.
The Oz factor, as in, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Precisely. The Oz factor is a specific set of sensory symptoms that precipitate a close encounter, and witnesses almost uniformly report this sudden, eerie, unnatural cessation of ambient noise.
I have read so many accounts of this. People say the crickets just abruptly stop, the birds stop singing, the sound of traffic on the highway just vanishes into thin air.
The wind dies down.
Yeah, and the air starts to feel incredibly thick, almost electrically charged, like that heavy moment right before a massive thunderstorm breaks.
It creates the acute impression that the witness has been temporarily excised from the material world. Like they've been deposited into a dreamlike, magical environment where the ordinary laws of physics and time simply no longer apply.
So it's essentially an isolation tactic.
It is a profound isolation tactic. And what's crucial to understand is that this effect is highly localized. It forms a sphere of effect. Investigators have found that observers located just outside this immediate zone see and hear absolutely nothing anomalous.
Wait, really? So if I'm in the bubble, it's dead silent, but a guy 100 feet away.
The crickets are still chirping for him. He doesn't see the light. He doesn't feel the static.
That is wild. I was trying to think of a good way to describe this. It's almost like the phenomenon puts noise-canceling headphones on the universe just to ensure it has your absolute undivided attention.
That's a very accurate analogy. The Oz factor isolates the subject epistemologically.
Okay, pause right there. Epistemologically.
Hmm.
Explain that like I'm 5, because that is a heavy word.
Fair enough. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know, how we gather information to construct our reality. So when I say it isolates them epistemologically, I mean it systematically cuts the wires to their normal sensory input.
It takes away their ability to rely on their 5 senses.
Exactly. It dictates that the categories you previously used to make sense of the world, like linear time, logic, the laws of physics, are fundamentally invalid in that moment.
Got it. It pulls the rug out from under your entire worldview.
Right. The philosopher Mark Fisher wrote extensively about the concept of the weird. He defined the weird not just as something scary, like a monster, but as a profound sensation of wrongness.
A feeling that something is here that shouldn't be.
A realization that something is present that does not belong in our established categories of reality. The Oz factor plunges you into that state of total psychological vulnerability.
And what's crazy is how perfectly this maps back to our earlier point about magic. Because if you think about a traditional occult ritual, what is the very first thing a ceremonial magician does before summoning anything?
They cast a circle.
Right. They draw a circle on the floor, and the whole point of that circle is to separate the sacred working space from the profane, mundane world outside. It ensures whatever they are interacting with manifests within a highly controlled, isolated boundary.
Which means the UFO's anomalous zone, this sudden bubble of weirdness and absolute silence on the highway, is essentially a mobile ritual circle.
A mobile ritual circle. Wow.
It operates on the exact interface between the physical world and the mind.
Okay, so you're trapped in this mobile ritual circle. The world has gone quiet. The Oz factor is in full effect. Then the extraction begins. But as we look at the history of these accounts, this extraction is rarely physical, right? I mean, you aren't getting physically dragged out of your car by a mechanical tractor beam.
Almost never. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions perpetuated by Hollywood. The mechanics of how the subject is transported from their physical location to the domain of the entities demonstrate profound similarities to esoteric traditions, specifically astral projection, rather than a physical kidnapping.
So how do people actually describe that extraction process? Because it always sounds so surreal when you read the transcripts of these regressions.
Abductees consistently report a sensation of weightlessness. They describe floating out of their beds, passing effortlessly through solid, matter-like walls, ceilings, or closed glass windows, and being drawn up into a hovering craft, often on a beam of solid, tangible light.
But the physical evidence of this departure is incredibly rare. I mean, if a biological alien literally pulled your physical body through a closed window, the glass would break.
Exactly. But here, the victim almost always wakes up the next morning in their own bed, in the exact paralyzed position they started in.
And yet they have these incredibly vivid, deeply traumatizing memories of an extended physical ordeal aboard a ship.
Right. This sensation of localized levitation, bodily paralysis, and passing through solid objects perfectly mirrors the out-of-body experience, or OBE. In worldwide mystical traditions, astral travel involves the consciousness separating from the physical vessel.
Often tethered by what esoteric traditions call the silver cord.
Right? Yes, exactly.
So if the person's physical body is still lying in bed, sweating and terrified, does that mean the spaceship isn't a physical vehicle parked in their front yard at all? Is it more like a shared, hyperdimensional waiting room for the mind?
The evidence strongly points to the craft being a construct of consciousness, or perhaps an environment in a parallel dimension, rather than a physical hull made of titanium. It is a forced, non-consensual extraction of human consciousness. And to truly understand how this happens, we have to look at the intersection of this phenomenon with the biology of sleep paralysis.
I was really hoping we would get to this. Because sleep paralysis is terrifying, but it has a very clear physiological explanation. Walk us through what is actually happening in the brain during sleep paralysis.
Sure. So sleep paralysis occurs when the cognitive and physiological components of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is when we dream, become completely desynchronized.
They get out of sync.
Right. During normal REM sleep, your brain essentially paralyzes your body. This is the built-in safety mechanism called rematonia. It prevents you from physically acting out your dreams and getting hurt.
Right, so you don't actually try to run away if you're dreaming about being chased by a bear. You stay still in bed.
Exactly. But in sleep paralysis, your conscious mind wakes up. But the switch for rematonia hasn't flipped off yet. So you are fully conscious, lying in your bed, but you are completely immobilized. You cannot move a single muscle.
And that biological glitch causes sheer panic.
Pure physiological terror. Your brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, goes into absolute overdrive. It knows you are vulnerable. And because you are still hovering on the border between sleeping and waking, a liminal state known as hypnagogia, your brain begins to project dream imagery directly into your waking environment.
The hypnagogic hallucinations. This is when people hear the loud buzzing sounds, the electrical tingling, they feel a heavy weight on their chest, and they see those dark, hovering figures standing in the corner of their bedroom.
Yes. Now think about this from a psychological perspective. Psychologists like Richard McNally and Nicholas Spanos have studied how individuals process this extreme trauma. Your brain is experiencing unexplainable terror, and it desperately needs a narrative to make sense of what is happening to you. So it reaches for culturally available scripts.
The pop culture filing cabinet.
Precisely. If you lived in the Middle Ages, your brain reached for the concept of the incubus. If you lived in 19th century Ireland, it reached for the fairy folk. But today, if you are a person who has consumed modern media or you're highly fantasy prone, your brain reaches for the sci-fi mythos of our era.
And then, often under the influence of hypnotic regression months or years later, the vague, blurry terrors of that hypnagogic state get formalized. They get polished into the highly structured narrative of an alien medical examination. The blurry shadow in the corner becomes a gray alien.
That is the psychological mechanism at play.
Yeah.
But we must be very, very careful here. Viewing this psychologically does not invalidate the sheer trauma of the experience.
I am so glad you said that, because I don't want anyone listening to this who has experienced something like this to feel like we're just saying, oh, it's just a made-up dream, get over it. The trauma is completely real to the person experiencing it.
The trauma is profoundly real. What the psychological framework does is highlight the mechanism by which the human brain translates complex, ineffable, neurological, or spiritual trauma into a coherent narrative that the conscious mind can process.
It's a translation algorithm.
Exactly.
And we know this translation algorithm goes back way before the Middle Ages. The earliest structural precursor to this astral abduction is actually the archaic practice of the shamanic journey, isn't it?
It is. The religious historian Mircea Eliade wrote extensively about what he called soul flight, or the techniques of ecstasy. In traditional shamanism, the shaman is involuntarily taken by spirits.
So it's not a choice.
Rarely. Their consciousness is violently pulled from their body, they are subjected to terrifying visions, and they're brought before an assembly of non-human entities in another realm.
Eliade talked about the axis mundi, right? The world tree.
Yes. The axis mundi is the cosmic center, a vertical pillar that connects the terrestrial sphere of humanity to the celestial and underworld spheres of the spirits. In the contemporary context, the hovering UFO acts as the modern axis mundi.
Oh, wow.
And the tractor beam of light, drawing the abductee upward, is the technological equivalent of the shaman's magical flight into forbidden, hyperdimensional regions.
Okay, so the extraction is an astral, psychological, or hyperdimensional event. We are pulled up the technological world tree. But what actually happens once you are inside the craft? Because the events that take place on that sterile examination table aren't random. They follow an incredibly ancient, rigid, almost theatrical script.
The consistency is staggering. The folklorist Thomas Bullard conducted a massive landmark structural analysis of 270 different abduction reports from all around the world. He stripped away the superficial details and looked purely at the sequence of events.
And what did he find? Because this is where it gets really structured.
He found that regardless of the subject's background, age, or prior knowledge of UFOs, the narratives hold a remarkable coherency. He identified a universal sequence that occurs in almost every major case.
And what are those steps?
Capture, examination, conference, tour, otherworldly journey, theophany, return, and aftermath.
Capture, examination, conference, tour, otherworldly journey, theophany, return, aftermath. I mean, that isn't a sci-fi movie trope. That is the exact framework of a traditional human rite of passage.
It is. To understand how perfectly it aligns, we have to look at the work of the French anthropologist Arnold van Gennep. He mapped out how rites of passage function in traditional societies. He called it the triadic structure, consisting of 3 mandatory phases: separation, liminality, and reincorporation.
And the alien abduction narrative maps onto this anthropological blueprint.
With astonishing, almost chilling precision. The first phase, separation, is the Oz factor. The individual's forcefully separated from their community, completely isolated physically and psychologically on a dark road or in their bedroom.
They're cut out of the herd.
Yes. Then comes the second phase, liminality. This is the threshold state. The subject is transported into the sterile, boundaryless environment of the craft. The craft serves as the modern initiatory chamber, the equivalent of the cave of the ancestors.
Right, the place outside of time.
In this state, their previous identity, their ego, and their understanding of reality are systematically dismantled.
And then the final phase, reincorporation, is the return.
Yes, they are deposited back into their natural environment, often with missing time, fundamentally and permanently altered by the ontological shock of the experience. They return to the tribe as a changed person.
I want to zoom in on that middle phase, liminality, because this is the part that terrifies people the most. This is the medical examination. Abductees describe being stripped naked, placed on cold metallic tables, and subjected to highly invasive probing. They describe biological material being extracted by clinical, emotionally detached entities. I have a hard time buying that a sterile, traumatic medical exam on a spaceship is actually a spiritual ritual. Where is the connection there?
The connection lies in the shamanic dismemberment ordeal. The alien procedure is simply the contemporary, technologically draped manifestation of an incredibly brutal ancient rite. In traditional animistic societies all over the world, the shamanic candidate is taken to a cave by ancestral spirits and subjected to visionary surgery.
Visionary surgery. What does that actually entail?
It's a hallucinatory experience of total physical breakdown. Their body is conceptually dismembered. They literally watch as their flesh is scraped from their bones. Their internal organs are removed, cleansed, and often replaced with magical stones or crystals.
That is intensely visceral. I know the source material specifically points to the Arunta people of Central Australia as a perfect example of this.
The Arunta provide a flawless parallel. During their initiation, the shamanic candidate lies at the entrance of a sacred cave. They experience a profound vision where spirits throw invisible lances that literally pierce their body. The spirits enter through these wounds, restructure their internal anatomy, and grant them new magical powers.
So if we strip away the modern aesthetic, the cold clinical alien examination isn't a science experiment at all. It's spiritual surgery disguised in a lab coat.
That's exactly what it is. The alien examination table is the initiatory altar. Think about the alien implants that you constantly hear about in modern lore.
Oh, right. The tiny metallic or crystalline objects supposedly lodged in the nasal cavity or the limbs of abductees. People are always demanding MRI scans to prove those exist physically.
But phenomenologically, those implants are the exact equivalent of shamanic spirits inserting quartz crystals into the initiate. It's meant to tune them to higher frequencies of reality. They aren't physical tracking devices. They are symbolic markers of initiation.
But why is it so violent? Why use trauma, terror, and often reproductive violation as the primary way to interact with us? If these beings are so advanced, couldn't they just leave a burning bush or, I don't know, send us a telepathic message of peace?
To understand that, we have to analyze the epistemological function of trauma. We have to look at how trauma physically and chemically changes the brain. In pre-Christian cultures and in deep esoteric traditions, there was a concept known as carnal knowledge.
Knowing the divine through the flesh.
Yes, knowing the divine through intense, transgressive, highly physical, and often painful encounters. This was historically deemed a much more profound, permanent way of altering human consciousness than mere visual revelation or gentle meditation.
This sounds a lot like the historical accounts of witchcraft Sabbaths, or even the satanic ritual abuse panic of the 1980s. Extreme, localized trauma designed to break the mind.
It utilizes the same psychological mechanism. The trauma serves a highly specific function. It completely shatters the subject's existing rational worldview. The entities operate with that cold clinical detachment because they are not there to befriend you.
They aren't your pals.
No. They are there to re-engineer your reality.
Yeah.
They are executing a structured, highly controlled trauma to fundamentally alter your psychic architecture.
It's an alchemical process. You have to burn the base metals down to ash before you can turn them into gold. You have to break the person down so completely that their old reality just ceases to exist.
And this intense physical and psychological breakdown leads to the ultimate goal of any initiation across human history, the rebirth of the initiate. The culmination of the ritual is symbolic death and resurrection.
This completely mirrors the ancient mystery religions, doesn't it? Like the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, where initiates would be plunged into darkness and terror in subterranean caves. Or Hermetic texts like the Poimandres, where the initiate learns that cosmic ascent requires the absolute death of the lower self.
The initiate undergoes a terrifying descent, faces the absolute paralyzing terror of death, and is reborn into a state of higher cosmological understanding. And this is explicitly described in modern abduction literature. Consider Whitley Strieber's famous book, Communion, which is perhaps the most well-known abduction account in modern history.
I remember reading that. The cover alone is terrifying. That staring alien face.
In the book, Strieber describes his ordeal in the cabin, and he notes a specific moment during the absolute peak of the terror, during the examination. He writes that the fear became so overwhelming that essentially Whitley ceased to exist.
Total ego death.
Yes. The ego is completely annihilated. The rational narrative self that says, I am Whitley, I am a human, I live in New York, is erased. And what is fascinating, as Thomas Buller's structural analysis points out, is that immediately post-death, the behavior of the entities drastically transitions.
Right. Once the initiate submits to the process, the aliens stop being tormentors. They take off the surgical gloves, so to speak, and become instructors. This is the conference or tour phase.
The examination ends, and the subject is often given a tour of the craft or brought before a senior entity, often described as a mantis-type being or a taller, older gray. This is the theophany, the moment of divine instruction.
And what are they instructing us on? They impart apocalyptic imagery, ecological warnings, or complex star maps. I mean, the most famous example is Betty Hill, who was shown a holographic star map that the entities claimed showed trade routes and exploration paths. It's essentially telepathic transmission of esoteric knowledge.
And look at the aftermath of this resurrection. Look at what happens to these people years after the event. Upon reincorporation into normal society, abductees rarely just go back to being ordinary accountants or school teachers. They often return with heightened psychic abilities. They report increased intuition, premonitions.
They also develop highly animistic spiritual worldviews. They suddenly care deeply about the interconnectedness of nature, and they have profound, agonizing ecological concerns about the destruction of the planet.
Those are the exact traits of a fully initiated shaman returning to their tribe. They live a divided existence. They belong partly to the human world and partly to the other world, carrying a permanent mark of calling.
Think about what this means for a second, especially if you are listening to this and wondering why any of this matters to you. The phenomenon is basically capturing ordinary people, breaking their ego down to absolute zero through controlled trauma, just so it can install a completely new cosmic operating system in their brains and then releasing them back into the population. What are they training us for?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the entities are acting as cosmological agents. They are performing fixed mythic roles designed to steer human consciousness toward a very specific, designated cognitive state.
Okay, this is where the wheels completely fall off the spaceship narrative for me. If this is all a highly orchestrated mythic theater, if they are perfectly mimicking ancient shamanic rituals to alter human consciousness over centuries, then the idea of aliens flying biological probes across linear space from the Zeta Reticuli star system completely falls apart. It just doesn't make any logical sense. So who or what is actually pulling the strings?
This is where we must systematically dismantle the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And the French astrophysicist and computer scientist Jacques Vallée is the pioneer of this deconstruction. Vallée points out the absolute statistical absurdity of the ETH.
Walk us through his math because it's brilliant.
Vallée looked at the global data. There are millions of close encounters and landings on record across the globe over the last 70 years. If we assume these are biological entities conducting a simple scientific survey of Earth-taking soil samples, studying human biology, the sheer volume of landings is incredibly inefficient.
Right. I mean, if we send a rover to Mars, we don't send 100,000 rovers over 70 years to scoop up dirt in secret. We take a few samples, and we have the data. If they were just scientists gathering data, they would have finished the job in 1947.
They act more like trickster gods than astronauts. Biological extraterrestrials would have no logical reason to flawlessly replicate human religious initiation structures or to paralyze someone just to show them an apocalyptic vision of the Earth burning, only to wipe their memory and put them back in bed.
So if they aren't from outer space, where are they from?
This is why researchers like Jacques Vallée and the journalist John Keel propose the interdimensional and ultra-terrestrial hypotheses.
Meaning, not beings crossing physical space in ships, but intelligences interacting with us from parallel dimensions. Or, as I've heard it described, existing on a superspectrum of electromagnetic energy that coexists right on top of our own reality. They are here, we just can't see them until they tune into our frequency.
Exactly. John Keel, in his landmark work Operation Trojan Horse, theorized that these ultra-terrestrials manipulate human belief systems. Because they exist outside of our linear time and perception, they use deliberate deception to interact with us.
A masquerade.
Right. They appear as whatever makes sense to our cultural framework at the time. Miracles in antiquity, fairies in the Middle Ages, or space aliens today.
Keel's work is fascinating, especially his take on the Men in Black. And to be clear, we are not talking about the Will Smith movie here. We are talking about the intensely bizarre, surreal, pale figures in ill-fitting dork suits who supposedly harass UFO witnesses.
Yes. According to Keel, the MIBs are not government agents. They are an extension of the phenomenon itself. They exist to induce paranoia and what Keel called deep weirdness.
Deep weirdness, because their behavior is just so absurd.
Exactly. Drinking Jell-O, speaking like machines, possessing no understanding of basic human customs. They act as an absurd counterbalance to ensure the witness's story sounds too crazy for the general public to believe. It further confuses the narrative.
And Vallée echoes this idea of hidden manipulation. He talks about the invisible college, an invisible, highly advanced network guiding humanity from the shadows. And he directly references ancient Rosicrucian teachings, which posited that invisible high initiates secretly steer the course of human history.
And we can see how current theoretical physics acts as the modern cloak for this. Superstring theory, Kaluza-Klein's five-dimensional theory, the many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, these scientific frameworks act as the modern rationale for the phenomenon. Just as theology and alchemy provided the vocabulary centuries ago, quantum physics provides the vocabulary today for how interdimensional entities might access our world.
We also have to talk about the psychological angle, because Carl Jung had a massive revelation about this. The famous psychoanalyst wrote an entire book on the subject called Flying Saucers. And he didn't view this as a purely physical event, nor did he just dismiss UFOs as simple hallucinations.
Jung viewed the phenomenon through the lens of archetypes emerging from the collective unconscious of humanity. He was writing during the peak of the Cold War, a time of extreme, unprecedented nuclear anxiety.
The entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for mutual assured destruction.
Exactly. And Jung argued that the human psyche, under that level of existential stress, projected mandalas into the sky. Mandalas are ancient, circular symbols of cosmic unity, wholeness, and divine order. The flying saucer, a perfect luminous disk, is a technological mandala.
The mind is desperate for intervention. We are living in a terrifying, sterile, secular cosmos where we can no longer intellectually accept angels coming down to save us, so the collective unconscious co-creates the experience we can accept. Highly advanced, rational space brothers coming to save us from our own nuclear weapons.
The alien is a myth deeply required by our modern society. It is mythology wearing a lab coat.
Okay, this brings us to the ultimate question of this entire deep dive. If we accept that this is an omnipresent, interdimensional force, or a powerful archetype emerging from our collective unconscious, a force that interfaces with the human psyche through trauma and initiation, what is its ultimate goal for humanity? Where is this all heading? What is the teleology of the phenomenon?
Well, teleology being the explanation of phenomena by the purpose they serve rather than by postulated causes, the ultimate endgame. The sources present two primary theoretical models for the teleology of the UFO phenomenon. The first is the control system proposed by Jacques Vallée. The second is the developmental driver, proposed by contemporary theorists like Stuart Davis.
Let's look at the control system first, because this insight alone is worth the price of admission. Vallée says the phenomenon functions as a massive, self-regulating spiritual thermostat for human consciousness.
A thermostat is a perfect analogy. Think about how a thermostat works in your house. If the room gets too cold, the heater kicks on. If it gets too hot, the air conditioning kicks on. It maintains equilibrium. Vallée theorizes that the phenomenon maintains the equilibrium of human belief.
So if a society becomes too cold, meaning too rigid, too scientifically dogmatic, too stripped of wonder and spirituality, the phenomenon injects a dose of pure absurdity. It shows a highly credible pilot an impossible aerial craft defying physics, or it puts a surreal entity in someone's bedroom. It does this to violently fracture our consensus reality and force the culture to expand its parameters.
Conversely, if society becomes too hot, too chaotic, overly superstitious, or dominated by irrational cults, it shifts its manifestations to reinforce cosmic order and cold logic. But the most brilliant part of Vallée's theory is how it explains the lack of absolute proof.
Right, the eternal question. Why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Why are all the photos blurry? Why is the evidence always just out of reach?
Because absolute physical proof would destroy the mechanism. If a saucer landed on the White House lawn, the mystery would be solved. The phenomenon would be categorized, institutionalized by science, and stripped of its psychological power. It intentionally never provides absolute proof because it must maintain the mythic tension required to shape our subconscious over millennia. It operates on the level of myth because myth is what slowly rewrites the architecture of human civilization.
It is conditioning us, generation by generation, without us ever fully realizing it. But the second model, the developmental driver, is a bit more optimistic, isn't it? Theorists like Stuart Davis posit that this isn't just about maintaining a comfortable equilibrium, it's an evolutionary catalyst.
Yes, in the developmental driver model, the intelligence is intentionally destabilizing our paradigms to rapidly accelerate our cognitive and spiritual development. By forcing intimacy with a radically advanced, non-human intelligence, it shatters human anthropocentrism.
It aggressively reminds us that we are not the apex predators of reality. We aren't the center of the universe.
Exactly. And by imparting these ecological warnings and apocalyptic visions during the tour phase of the abduction, it is actively trying to prevent us from causing eschaton-level problems like global nuclear annihilation or total ecological collapse.
It captures ordinary people, gives them the shamanic initiation, and returns them to society as modern emissaries. It uses these initiated shamans to subtly, organically shift the collective consciousness of the species toward a necessary evolutionary leap.
So we really have to ask ourselves, are we living in a cosmic terrarium, being kept at a comfortable, manageable temperature by an interdimensional control system, or are we being dragged, kicking and screaming through traumatic initiation to the next rung of the evolutionary ladder by a developmental driver?
It really is an incredible journey when you step back and look at the whole picture. We started today with Scottish fairies extracting pith and milk in the damp chill of the 17th century. We moved through the terrifying, noise-canceling silence of the Oz factor and explored the biological and hyperdimensional mechanics of shamanic soul flights. We looked at how ancient dismemberment ordeals are still happening today on clinical, metallic, alien examination tables. And finally, we explored the ultimate interdimensional purpose, whether it is controlling us or evolving us.
It forces us to completely reevaluate our place in the cosmos. But as we conclude, I want to leave you with a thought that builds on everything we've discussed today. A thought that flips the perspective entirely.
Lay it on us.
If this interdimensional force so perfectly mirrors the deepest architectures of human psychology, if it relies entirely on human mythology, and perfectly replicates traditional human rituals of initiation, what if the intelligence we are interacting with isn't truly an other at all?
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
What if the phenomenon is actually the future, highly evolved, hyperdimensional state of human consciousness itself? A future version of humanity reaching backward through the cracks in space-time to interact with its own ancestors, utilizing our own ancestral mythic languages, fairies, demons, aliens, to initiate us, to guide us away from self-destruction, and to ensure its own eventual survival.
So the ancient code we're looking at under the hood of the simulation. It's not just ancient magic, it's our magic. We wrote it. We are abducting ourselves to save ourselves. That is a lot to process. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the edges of your own reality. Look at the sky a little differently tonight, and we'll catch you next time.